Global metal markets are experiencing sharp fluctuations after Iranian attacks targeting two major aluminum producers in the Middle East sparked fears of a new supply crisis. Notably, according to analysts, this is not merely an isolated military development, but has quickly transformed into a systemic shock to the global supply chain. The attacks caused direct damage to large-scale aluminum smelting hubs, pushing aluminum prices to multi-year highs and increasing the risk of prolonged shortages. Observers argue that when a foundational material like aluminum is disrupted, the impact does not stop at the metal market but spreads throughout the entire industrial manufacturing ecosystem. Aluminum is present in almost every strategic sector, from consumer electronics to automobiles and energy. Therefore, this supply shock is viewed as a chain reaction, from production disruptions and material shortages to rising input costs and ultimately escalating consumer product prices. Smartphones and electric vehicles, icons of modern technology, are forecast to face significant price pressure if this situation persists. From a broader perspective, the event exposes an inherent weakness of globalization, the dependence on geopolitical bottlenecks. When key regions like the Middle East become unstable, the entire supply chain can be destabilized. In this context, an attack on an aluminum plant is no longer just a story for the metal industry. It becomes a warning sign of the fragility of today's global economy. Looking deeper into the issue, many experts believe the problem lies not in the aluminum itself, but in the structure of the global supply chain. Aluminum is just a prime example of a foundational material, something that almost every modern industry depends on. From consumer electronics, automobiles, and construction to renewable energy, aluminum is ubiquitous due to its lightweight, durable, and thermally conductive properties. This ensures that any supply shock does not stop at one industry, but spreads through a domino effect. The core issue lies in the fact that global aluminum production is concentrated in certain regions, with the Middle East playing a vital role in exports. When major plants in this region are attacked, the risk is not just a drop in output, but also a disruption in trade flows. In particular, the Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 1/5 of the world's oil and a significant portion of industrial metals pass, has long been considered a geopolitical bottleneck. Once this route is controlled or disrupted, the impact ripples globally almost immediately. From that viewpoint, it is evident that the world is dangerously dependent on such geographical choke points, where a single disturbance is enough to shake the entire system. The mechanism of this shock's impact is actually not overly complex, yet it is very difficult to control. Analysts often describe it as a clear reaction chain. Conflict leads to production disruption, followed by supply shortages, which in turn drive up aluminum prices. As input material prices rise, corporate production costs are forced to adjust accordingly, and ultimately, those costs are passed on to consumers through product prices. At a more specific level, this impact is very apparent. In the electronics industry, aluminum is a crucial material for smartphone casings, laptops, and many heat-dissipating components. When aluminum prices rise, manufacturers' profit margins shrink, forcing them to either raise selling prices or cut costs elsewhere. For the automotive industry, especially electric vehicles, EVs, aluminum plays a pivotal role in reducing vehicle weight to optimize battery efficiency. Rising aluminum prices mean higher EV production costs at a time when the industry needs to lower prices to expand its market. Even the renewable energy sector is not immune, as solar panels and mounting systems utilize aluminum in large proportions. For this reason, many argue that this is a classic form of cost-push inflation, where prices rise not because of a boom in consumer demand, but because input costs are driven up by external factors such as conflict or supply chain disruptions. What is worrying is that this type of inflation is often harder to control, as it cannot be resolved solely through monetary policy but depends on restoring supply, a difficult task in a complex geopolitical landscape. In that context, the question arises as to whether there is a market savior who can compensate for the shortfall. China, as the world's largest aluminum producer, is often mentioned as a candidate. With an output accounting for more than half of the global total, the country theoretically has enough capacity to increase supply and cool down prices. However, the reality is much more complicated. Analysts suggest that China no longer plays the role of an absolute pressure relief valve as it did in the past. Its aluminum industry is facing various constraints, from capacity control policies aimed at avoiding oversupply to pressure to reduce emissions in energy-intensive industries. Reopening smelters or increasing capacity cannot happen instantly, nor is it always permitted by the government. In other words, while there is room for China to intervene in the market, it is no longer as flexible as before. This leads to a consequence. The world may be losing an important buffer for commodity prices. Without a supply source large enough and fast enough to offset shocks, the market becomes more sensitive to fluctuations, and prices tend to rise more sharply and for longer periods. In such a system, seemingly localized events, like an attack on an aluminum plant, can create waves of impact that reach far beyond their original scope, touching sectors closely tied to daily life. Notably, market interest is shifting from how high aluminum prices will go to whether there remains a force strong enough to keep the market from spiraling out of control. And the name mentioned most often is still China. With output accounting for more than half of the global aluminum supply, China theoretically has the ability to cover the shortfall from the Middle East and even pull prices down if necessary. For years, the commodities market has been accustomed to China increasing production as a pressure relief valve whenever there was a supply shock, helping to stabilize prices. But the current context has changed. Many experts argue that China is no longer as flexible in adjusting aluminum output. Aluminum smelting is one of the largest electricity-consuming industries and has high carbon emissions. Therefore, Beijing has implemented fairly strict capacity control policies, especially in the context of its carbon neutrality commitments. Additionally, there are energy constraints, as many regions still have to balance industrial production with power security. This means that flipping the switch to increase production is no longer simple. Reality shows that China's aluminum output in recent years has nearly hit the policy ceiling, hovering around more than 45 million tons per year. The remaining spare capacity is minimal and cannot be put into operation immediately. In other words, China remains a major player, but it is no longer a lifeline that can respond quickly to every fluctuation. When the capacity to intervene is limited, the global market loses a vital balancing force. What is the consequence? Some analysts believe the world is gradually losing its buffer for commodity prices. Previously, when supply was disrupted in one region, there was always another source, usually China, that could quickly fill the void. But in the current context, that gap may persist longer, keeping prices high for extended periods. This makes the market more sensitive to shocks, and every geopolitical fluctuation has the potential to be amplified into an economic issue. From here, the story no longer stops at aluminum or the Middle East. It opens up a larger picture of how the global economy operates. Many believe the world is entering a new phase where supply chains are no longer organized purely by the logic of cost efficiency, but are increasingly dominated by geopolitical factors. Where to place a factory, where to import raw materials from, or which route to transport them through is now not just an economic puzzle, but a security one. In such a world, commodity prices no longer merely reflect supply-demand relationships. Instead, they begin to carry an additional invisible cost, the cost of geopolitical risk. When a major production region is at risk of instability, material prices will rise not only because of an actual supply shortage, but because the market prices in the possibility of future disruptions. This explains why aluminum prices can surge following an attack, even before the actual damage has been determined. From a social perspective, the final consequence still falls back on the consumer. Products that seem highly technological and modern, such as smartphones or electric vehicles, are actually heavily dependent on vulnerable physical supply chains. A phone with a unibody design, an electric vehicle made lighter to save battery, all require aluminum. When the price of this material rises, businesses have few options other than adjusting selling prices or cutting costs in other areas. And perhaps The most thought-provoking point is the increasingly clear link between seemingly distant events and daily life. An attack on an aluminum plant in the Middle East, after all, does not stop at the geopolitical map. It can appear in the bill for a smartphone, the price of an electric vehicle, or the cost of building a house. In other words, a shock at the head of the supply chain today could entirely become a cost that global consumers must bear tomorrow.